Even if you're not a Stephen King fan, you've probably heard of Misery, where a writer's number one fan kidnaps and tortures him, making him write a new book for her. Well, after years of being a fan of the Rob Reiner movie, I finally read the book a while back. So, what do I think of it? I think it was great, although I wouldn't say the book was better. What I will say is that I like Annie Wilkes more than I liked Cujo, and I happen to like Cujo. So there are differences between the book and the film. As anyone might guess, the novel Misery has significant differences. To me, it seems the Annie of the film is more driven by delusion or even romanticism. In the novel, however, Annie seems more into inflicting cruelty for its own sake, and Paul Sheldon's Misery novels mostly appeal to her sense of fantasy. Whereas in the film, it seems like she actually needs them almost as a way of surviving. In the book, she may be obsessed with them, but it almost seems like Annie might have kidnapped Paul Sheldon, even if he wasn't a famous author and her favorite author. It seems like she was more into the cruelty aspect of things. I could be wrong about that, and it's kind of my opinion, but the novel definitely makes her seem more diabolical in general. To her, Paul Sheldon is like a prestigious prize, and she can use and abuse him as she pleases. In the film, her mood changes pretty rapidly, and the book is different. It seems to have her change more like seasons, I guess you could say. The changes are less rapid, they're more like gradual, I would say. The cinematic Annie Wilkes conveys more of a berserker rage, but she is sometimes sweet, even caring, and it all goes downhill when she loses control and ends up in a dark mood. In the novel, however, she seems more purely evil and sadistic overall, and she's followed by a perpetual dark cloud everywhere she goes. It's even hard to imagine how she can function outside of her own house and outside of herself. So that there are other things that make the novel different from other Stephen King novels. Many of Stephen King's stories involve science fiction elements, whereas this one has practically none. It is more grounded in cold, hard American realism, showing a plausible descent into hell. It's also interesting to see a creative person tormented by their number one fan. Misery examines a writer trying to change his content, but being forced, in this case quite literally, to stick with his famous brand. In the process, there are many side issues addressed. For one thing, how does one come up with the right answers to questions beckoned by a story? Sheldon's stories are seemingly brimming with plot holes, and being pressured by Annie certainly won't help make any additional sense of his work. So that's actually one of the interesting struggles in the novel. On that note, I've been thinking of how Stephen King could have written the story differently. And this is not as a critique, but as sort of a thought experiment. I think it would have been interesting if Annie Wilkes held on to Paul Sheldon longer, making him write numerous other books before eventually killing him. Then she could have attempted publishing a Sheldon book under her own name, leading her to being tracked down through forensic linguistics. I think that would be an interesting story. Maybe it's even been written somewhere before, though not featuring Annie Wilkes. That aside, there's another theme I like in Misery, which is somewhat more emphasized in the novel. Paul basically has to live and die for the book, by the book. It basically has to consume him. There's even a sense that he might have died had he not been so focused on getting that pesky novel done. I haven't heard any major theories on what made King focus on creating To Live, but it's probably part of his own personal story. For an artist, creating can be the main source of sanity, or conversely, sometimes it's also what can make us crazy. Perhaps Sheldon meeting his crazed number one fan is simply like a possessed artist meeting his match. In both the novel and film, he was in fact bleeding for his craft. In that sense, the story is surprisingly gimmicky for something so grounded in plausible reality. However, it's a gimmick that certainly works, and it would be hard to duplicate it because this is such an original story. You really could not write something similar to Misery without being accused of ripping it off. Of course, this is very far from King's most gimmicky stories. For example, Firestarter reminds me a bit of the X-Men, and many other King stories are even more absurd, such as, of course, Stephen King's It, which, I mean, Pennywise, I'm looking at you. So another question looms. Do I prefer the book or the movie? As shocking as this will sound, I actually prefer the movie. For one thing, Kathy Bates knocks it out of the park, and she even won an Academy Award for her performance. It also has some truly memorable lines perfected by her delivery. For example, when she talks about effin' pig feed and bitchly cow corn. It's just great stuff. And then you've got the classic line, "He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodie car." Just freaking awesome stuff. And the movie Annie Wilkes is also easier to sympathize with, making her more of a complex and interesting character, in my opinion. So that's why I ultimately prefer the movie over the book, even though that's sort of the pedestrian thing to say, I guess. But it's my honest preference. In any case, Misery reminds us that if we ever make it big, we may have to watch out for crazy fans. I've heard a few crazy fan stories too. For example, one of my favorite Guitar World interviews is with some guys from the band Korn. When asked about their weirdest fan encounter, they said that during a CD signing at a music store, some random fan brought a dead raccoon for them to autograph. It might not be the craziest thing one could do, but it's certainly not the sanest either. So when I look at Stephen King's Misery, I can't help but think, wow, this story could happen. It's frightful to think that in some person's brain, compartmentalized somewhere alongside their basic human needs, they feel so animated by fandom that they'd actually kidnap and terrorize the creative force they hold so dear. So maybe having a number one fan isn't so great after all.